Okay, so David, last time you and I got together, you talked about possibly having an additional discussion about versioning for Android.
Ah, yes, I remember that remark.
Yes, about what version of Android do you develop for? How do you make sure that you develop your application for the right version? Those kinds of things. So I've got about half an hour here where we can
Okay.
have a little discussion about it. So why don't you take it from there and tell me what was in your mind when you were making that comment?
Yeah, that absolutely. And a half an hour is, I think, enough. Although this is a really fascinating and sometimes frustrating kind of debate and conversation because I think most of the frustration for developers just comes from the idea that it's kind of confusing. It's pretty confusing. There are some correlations between iOS and Android in this, and we generally make comparisons and things like that in these conversations, and so we'll do a little bit of that. But I think Android frustrates developers when it comes to version control for two big reasons. And one is there's a lot of devices, right? And so when you're making a piece of software, I mean, wouldn't it be nice if you just kind of knew that it would run on everything? But that just isn't the case. And so that's frustrating for people. And then the other frustrating part in Android are this idea of this concept of libraries or compiling against some libraries, and that people don't quite understand what that means. And we'll open up Eclipse, and I'll kind of show you what I'm talking about. But really, what it boils down to is you have a lot of options and a lot of choices in terms of how do I prepare my application for distribution, right? How do I prepare it for um, an app store or my friend's phone or something like that. And so I'm going to share my screen here, and we will talk a little bit about these libraries, and we'll talk a little bit about some of this stuff that I'm calling frustrating. Now I'm sharing my whole screen, and I realize that you'll probably see Warren and my face in the top right-hand corner here, and you'll have to excuse me for this, but I really do enjoy looking at who I'm talking to. And today I'm talking to Warren, so we're going to leave Warren up there. At any rate, and so let's talk about those two things, starting with the second one, this idea of what are all these libraries and how do I actually control the version stuff. And then we'll kind of come back to this idea of a lot of different devices running a lot of different versions of Android. So what versions are there of Android? Right? A lot of people don't quite understand what are all the different versions. And so we're going to jump on the browser real quick, and we'll start there. And if you just do a quick Google search, Android versions, and you look at, see if I can get my Google up here. See if we have an Android minimum SDK version or something like that. Minimum SDK Android. I just want to show you the list. Here we go. So there's a Google page here, and I'll just kind of highlight it so you can kind of put your eyes on it if you want to try to copy it down, but you can always just Google for it. And the question is, how many versions of Android are there? The question that we were talking about. And you can see this is quite a big list, quite a big list. So Android 1.0, 1.1, 1.5, 1.6, and you can see kind of a natural progression of these versions as time went on. And so the platform version, which is kind of a term we got to get our head around here, it's just kind of a name, right? Technically speaking, it doesn't really mean anything. It's just a name for humans like us to kind of understand, hey, you run an Android 4.0? Yes. You run an Android 4.0.1? Yes. The more important number, and this is my opinion from a lot of experience doing this, the more important number is this API level. And I'll explain why I think it's more important here in just a sec when we open up Eclipse. But the thing I wanted to show you is, you'll see here that there's a couple of different versions of Android, 4.2, 4.2.2, 4.1, 4.1.1, or 4.0, 4.04. You'll see that there's a few different versions of Android that use the same API level. And that's an important thing to kind of understand. And really the easiest way to explain it is just think about the API level and not the version. Because if you try to get so precise about targeting a version, 4.0.2, you're going to find a relatively small number of devices that run literally that version down to like the third decimal place or whatever. So generally we speak in terms of like Android 3.0, Android 4.0. There's Android 4.1 or Android 4.2. That's starting to become kind of popular as we get to API level 16 and 17. But don't obsess over the tenths of a digit in Android, and try to think more of this API level. And again, we'll open up Eclipse and I'll explain that to you. The API level is used when you're compiling your app. The understanding of it is used when you're compiling your app, and you need to understand what that means so that when you package up your application and compile your application source code for the market, you kind of know what it's going to run on and what it's not going to run on. So we'll talk about that. So in Eclipse, and I'm going to leave this web page open right here, just kind of behind Eclipse. So in an Eclipse project, and I'm using a Mac, it'll look a little bit different on your Windows machine if you're running Windows, but the concept is the same. Every project has some properties that relate to the Android, in essence, SDK version. So if I open up the properties here and I look at the Android part of these properties in this project, you'll see we have this project build target. You'll see a long list here. And over here on the right, you have API level. So it starts at the top with the low API levels, 3 in this case, and it goes all the way down to 17 in this case. So these relate to, go back to the web page and run them side by side. These relate to this API level here on this reference page that Google publishes for us. So when we choose a platform target, what we're choosing is, there we go, side by side, the API level in our Android project properties. And it's going to always be related to a platform, right? So you can't say like I want to run platform 2.2, but API level 4. It won't let you do that. There's a direct relationship between the API level and the version. And remember on this screen where we had, on this reference document, where we had API version 4 or API level 14 is actually 4.0, 4.01, and 4.02.
Mm-hmm.
Your compiler and your tool will let you, here's 14 here, 14 here. It will let you target like 4.12, 4.22. It will let you do some kind of finer controls, but you probably aren't going to ever run into worrying about that. And you're just going to try to ask yourself, 3.0, 4.0, generally that's enough. Now 4.2.2, maybe some of these brand new sophisticated devices do have some features that aren't available. So that kind of takes us into the next thing. Why would I choose a higher API level versus a lower API level? And the easiest way to describe that is the reason levels come out and the reason Android keeps going up with their levels is because things improve. They add things. There's new features. There's new functions available on, say, an Android Galaxy S4 that weren't available on an Android Galaxy S2 that was running Android 3.0. So the operating system evolves. Actually, they work pretty closely with some of the hardware manufacturers like Samsung, and the hardware evolves, and they kind of evolve together. And so if you have a very sophisticated Android tablet, I think I've got a Nexus 7 here. If you've got a sophisticated Android tablet that's running a modern version of Android, 4.0 for example, you can make a piece of software that will support features on this device that won't work on older devices. So you would need to compile or package up your project with a more modern set of libraries, we call them, and we'll get to that in just a sec. But basically you're saying, I'm building an app that's intended for a modern gadget. And so that is this API level. So that's how you set it up in your project. from a technical perspective. You tell your compiler, this is the level that I want to use.
Let
Which
me,
takes us to go ahead, Warren.
I'm sorry.
No, that's right.
With the newer gadget, the Galaxy Tab you just showed,
Yep,
it's intended to run on, let's say, 4.0.
correct.
Are those backwards compatible? Let's say I
Yes.
did develop
Yep.
an application with version 2, for example.
Uh-huh.
Do I have some reassurance that newer devices will be able to run that older level of code?
Yeah, so far they've done really well with that, and they have, and Apple has too. There's very few. Well, there are cases, but they've done, I would call it a pretty good job at. If I bought a brand new iPhone, they'll run some pretty old apps, right? And so you actually raise an interesting question that we'll try to cover here in the time that we have. But I thought we were just going to go down one other path, but maybe we need to go down a third path. But your question is yes. In most cases, it'll run old software. However, there are apps that were written so strangely that the new devices don't understand them. It's kind of rare, but it could happen. And that actually happens in iOS, I would say even more maybe than Android, because there's apps that were written back in the day for like iOS 3.0, for example, that don't run at all on an iOS 5 device, right? They just crash and they just don't do very good. And yeah, you run into that in Android, but I think less so. That's just an opinion. It's hard to know. There's a whole other discussion there, though, because generally speaking, iOS apps are updated easier and, on and on and on. But
Right.
That's kind of a whole other talk. But so the question I hear more often than not is, if I make an app for a 4.0 Nexus, the question I hear goes the other way. Will it run on a 3.0, not BlackBerry, but Motorola Droid, that's running Android 2.2 or something?
Right.
What happens when I compile an app that's intended for a new phone and someone tries to install it on an old phone? The general answer is it'll probably not work. However, professional programmers, professional app makers, and certainly Google will recommend to you that you shouldn't even let them install it. So how do we do that? If you know in advance that you've taken advantage of all of these cool features found on modern hardware with modern processors and great cameras and all this stuff, and you try to run it on a 4-year-old Android device that looks like, this, that came from a market that doesn't have broadband, it's just this really low budget Android phone, or frankly it came from Walmart, and it's a $39
Right.
Android gadget that's just so underpowered it's almost useless. You shouldn't let people install that software on your software on their phones, because what will end up happening is they'll just be disappointed. They'll take up all your time with their questions, and it's just going to be bad for everybody. So how do we do that? So that's where the manifest comes in. So your project in Android has an Android manifest file. In the Android manifest, it's always, you can see it in my Project Explorer on the left, and I've got it opened up in kind of a raw XML view, but you could also open it up in, the little editor view like this. I'm a code guy, so I just do it manually. But what we're going to talk about here are 3 different values in the manifest that you need to have. I don't want to say you have to have, because I think you can get away with it without the version name, and I think you can get away with it without the minimum SDK version, but a bunch of problems happen. And so let's talk about these things. The first one is along the lines of what we were just talking about. How do I keep my app from getting installed on this thing if it's built for this thing? And that's where the minimum SDK version comes in. So this number 8 directly relates to this API level that we set our project for, that we're compiling for. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't compile our project with API level 17, but support maybe 14 devices. and 15 and 16. So we can compile with 17, and we can set our minimum level SDK to say 14. You're not forced into making those match.
But do you
It is
run?
important to understand what you're doing when they're different.
Yeah, you're running the risk of some features not working on the older
Bingo.
device.
Exactly. And so we'll talk about that in just a sec. But what is that thing doing fundamentally? All you're doing when you set this flag or you set this value in the Android manifest is you are telling the Android market, and you're telling the Android device who's trying to install your app, this thing doesn't go on this phone. It doesn't go on this phone. And so what ends up happening is when you download a piece of Android software using your device, even the old ones, they've always done this, the first thing they do is they read this manifest. And they look at the minimum SDK version. And the phone, if the phone's running 2.2 and your minimum SDK version is 14, they won't install it. It won't do it. And so that's how you prevent your software from showing up in a bad way, right? You don't want your software to show up that way. A lot of developers look at it the other way around, and they look at it like this. Well, wait a minute. I want my software on as many devices as I can. And they lose sight of the fact that really, even though it'll only work on some of those devices, you probably don't want to do that. But they're convinced that they do, and they experiment with all of this stuff. And I don't know where that mindset comes from. Maybe they're ignoring the support questions. Maybe they don't care about bad ratings. I don't know. But generally speaking, you should shoot to aim. Your goal should be to make software that runs really well on everything that it runs on. And don't let it run on things that it won't run well on. That's kind of the goal. So that's what the SDK version is for. Now, Warren brought up the next point, which is a really good point, which is, what happens when I have like one or two features that are only on certain devices? Because there are cases where you do want to compile with the modern stuff so that you can do something cool on certain devices, but not rule out everyone else. There's some fine control that you have there as a developer. So you can ask yourself, generally speaking, is this app worth using, on an older device if this one or two features don't work? And oftentimes you can say, yeah, this is a pretty good app anyway. It's not going to crash an Android 3.0 phone as long as I don't try to use these features. As long as they don't try to do something that we know will crash the device because they don't have a forward-facing camera or something. Can my app be a successful experience for people with older devices? And a lot of times it can be. But that just means that it's your responsibility as a developer to do some pretty sophisticated things to learn how to hide these features, how to educate the user so that they don't try to use something, or maybe you accidentally leave a button on a screen that says launch face cam to capture whatever, and or shake mode and there's no accelerometer or something like that. If the feature's not supported, generally you don't even want to make them available to them because they will tap everything and it will crash and they'll be upset. But so you got to do a little bit of work there. But there's plenty of cases and plenty of examples where that's a sound logic, right? There's nothing wrong with that. If you have a modern device, take a video now and upload it or whatever. That's okay. But you do need to do some work there to try to think through that kind of idea. I generally just say, you know what? I'm going to make software for this device. If I'm going to add, and that's it. You need 4.0 to run my project, or you need 3.0, or you need 2.2, or whatever I'm targeting. And if I'm going to make a different version, I'll literally replace the version. And I'll have Android version 1 and Android version 2, which is built for different devices.
So within the code, you showed in the manifest that where it would allow to install on a minimum level.
Yeah.
Within the code, let's say there's a particular feature that only works on SDK version 17.
Okay.
But you're allowing it to be installed on SDK level 14.
Got it. And you want to hide that button or something.
Yeah. So can it do an SDK check in the code somewhere?
That's a fantastic question. I'm going to use Google and Stack Overflow because it's much bigger font. And you'll see it on this recording better. But check this out. The reason I'm also Googling is because there's a few different strategies. Let's just determine Android version at runtime. Okay, so what ends up happening, let's talk about that question you just asked in a nerd kind of a way. Runtime means, look, it's on the device, the software's running, and I need to learn what the environment is, right? I'm not programming it. It's already programmed. My program needs to be smart enough to figure this out on the go, so at runtime. And so what you'll find is there's a couple of different opinions and a couple of different approaches to use it. And so what you can do, though, is you can check the android.os.build.version, and what you'll find, and you can do that in code, and what you'll find is you can, that class, in essence, the version class in Android, the information that's available to us are the three core pieces are called code name, incremental, and release. And so let's say you might want to know if it's ice cream sandwich, right, which is code name. If we go back here, right, you can see it's code name for everything 4.0, and 4.0 when it came out it was called ice cream sandwich, and then 4.1 became jelly bean. And the reason that might be important is you'll see here Jelly Beans 4.1 and 4.1 and 4.1.1, right? It's like several different, so you might just check for Jelly Bean. So you can do that with code name. But you might be, building an app for astronauts and it's mission critical that you know exactly what version they have, or somebody's life's going to depend on it. So you can check the incremental .04 type stuff if you wanted with the incremental information for property, I should say, from the version class. And then you can also just check the release string. And so this is a perfect segue into our last little topic. What is the release string? What the heck is that? So you see what I highlighted, the user visible version string. User visible version string. What in the world is that? Let's go back to our manifest, and I'll talk about what that is, because it's useful. We've all installed Android apps, and the first thing we see is a bunch of information about what we're about to install, and you can expand all of the permissions that the thing's going to need. That's the required permissions that you list in your manifest. Basically, the whole purpose of the manifest is to talk to the device before you install it. That's the whole reason it exists, so you can describe to the user and the App Store and the phone what you're about to do. And so you have all the versions, and you have all the permissions, and you have all. Now, certainly there's other purposes for the manifest. I'm minimizing that idea, but as a developer, really, that's what it's for, right? That's our way to tell people and tell devices and tell stores what we have. So, version code and version name. We talked about minimum SDK version, and that's where you decide what devices you're going to support. Version code and version name are different values, but in essence they work the same, or they have the same purpose. The version code is always a number, and it's generally going to be start at a 1, and your project's going to get in the App Store version 1. And then you're going to make an update 3 months later, and you're going to update it to version 2, and then version 3, and then version 4, and so on. You could go to 1, and then the next time you could go to 5 if you wanted. It would just make no sense. You can't do 1.3. It's an integer. It's a solid number. So 1, 2, 3, 4. That tells the Android marketplace and the Android device that you're updating. This app exists on the phone already at version 1, and because it's the same package name, which is in essence the unique identifier for the app, and it's a 2 now, oh, this is an update. Perfect. That's why you can't resubmit to the App Store another version 1. If you submit a version to the App Store and it's the first version, and then you try to resubmit another, they're going to make you increase that number each time. So that's all the number does. The version name is anything you want it to be. This is version 1.0. It's a string. Okay, Steve, take care. It's a string. You wouldn't want to write out, you know, this is my turbocharged, you know, turbo version 2. It's, you know, it's silly, but you could. And so I don't know what would happen if you had wrote a long series there. What most people do is they just kind of duplicate what they've done with the version 1 or whatever. But the point is you can query that information in our code. You can query that information in our code so that you can get creative as a developer. I mean, you own the software. It gives you fine control over these things. And I believe, it's been a while, is my Nexus on? I think it shows you the version description or something on the install page. So you have the version number, which Android uses. Then you have the version string, which they call version name. I call it version string because it's easier for me to remember that I can put anything I want in that string or that sentence. So we have 3 topics. Let's kind of review what we talked about. Minimum SDK version in your manifest tells the device and the market what it should run on. Version code is up to us as developers. We increment that up with each new release to the App Store. The version name is just the description. We can compile for newer devices and still let it run on older devices by using a minimum SDK version that's lower than what we're compiling for. We'll probably generate a warning or something in Eclipse, you know, telling us, hey, you've targeted API level 17, but you're allowing 13s. Are you sure you want to, you know, something like that? Yes. Our code is going to be responsible then for checking to make sure that this feature will work. One of the things that Android says, or Google, I always say Android, I talk about it like it's a person, but this is one of the really, really important kind of tenets of version control in Android. And I'm going to highlight the paragraph and then I'll just read a little bit of it because it's really, really important. Excuse me. The Android system does not use app versioning information to enforce restrictions on upgrades, downgrades, or compatibility. It doesn't care. You're the person who's responsible for enforcing these restrictions on whether it's compatible or not. The only thing they enforce is the SDK version that you can set, the minimum SDK version. If it'll install, because you let it install, because you said that with the 3 there that it'll install on everything, Android's not going to magically tell the user, oh, sorry, this feature's not available. It's not going to magically enforce this idea that, you know, you wanted to use a color gradient background that aren't supported on old devices. It's not going to it's not going to automatically determine that this device doesn't support gradients, so I'm going to show that no, it's just going to try to do what you said and it's going to crash. And so Android lets you decide. So again, is that good? Is that bad? I don't know, but I think it's fantastic personally because you have ultimate control over it, but with freedom comes risks. And you know, you got to know how that kind of stuff works. And so I think that's a fantastic topic that we can talk about a lot of, you know, over and over and over again. It's never going to make sense to everybody. It's never going to make sense to everybody. I struggle with it all the time, and I struggle with it because I find myself asking different questions. My development time, you know, for the last few years has been based on helping a lot of other people make software. And that's a little bit different than me making software on my own. And so with that said, I have to think differently about what version does like the BuzzTouch Core support or rely on, because we want to help.
That would be my question.
Yeah.
If somebody was going to put together a BuzzTouch project right now,
Uh-huh.
what is the recommended settings so that the features work?
Yeah, so if you look at your download, great question. If you look at your download and you get this PDF open, you'll see it will show you that you should compile this in 2.2. 2.2. And I'll show you a project. It's a great question. I'll show you a project that we were just looking at. And we had 3.0 selected. I'll show you the difference here. If we look at this project here, say we have Android 3.0. I was experimenting. It's the same project. It's not full of errors if I increase that number. But what if I say, you know what, I'm going to do 4.0 in my Android project, the one I just downloaded from my control panel, because I want to add like one new thing. Let's just say that as an example, I want to hack this up and add one new thing. I'm going to use the newest Android 4.2.2. Watch what will happen. The first thing that will happen is our compiler, this says Android 3.0 right here. It's going to switch in a minute. It takes a little bit of time. That's the previous libraries I was just linked to. You can see down here on the right, it's kind of loading. This is our famous Eclipse. It's not necessarily very fast. What we're going to expect to find here are a couple of errors and a couple of warnings. I can't remember what they'll be because it's been a while, but we'll find some here in just a sec. And what they're going to tell us are, yeah, you see all these yellow dots? These are all warnings that weren't there when we chose the older libraries. And most of these are going to be harmless. They're not errors. They're warnings, but I like projects that don't have any warnings or any errors. So for me, they're like, I'm a little OCD with warnings, right? I don't want to compile anything with any warnings. And most people, I believe, are the same way. You wouldn't want to download a project and see a bunch of warnings. But basically what you're going to find is certain things that we used to be able to do, like right here, have been deprecated. So Android draws a line through the command or the property we were trying to set or the function we were trying to call or method, depending on your description, and it's going to say, hey, this is now deprecated. And so they're telling us, if you use a little logic here, we're saying, oh, okay, a couple years ago, that's how Android used to want us to do it. Now, with the latest stuff, they've changed their mind, and they don't want us to do that anymore. And so for each thing that's deprecated, there's a new way to in this case, it's layout parameters.fill parent. You know, it's probably layout parameters dot, you know, max parent or match view or something. It's just, they just change their mind on what the field name is. And so you'll see though that there are no errors. I thought we'd get some errors. There are no errors. They're just warnings. And so when I go through this decision process, and when we make new things, and everybody knows that this is kind of old now, right? We're working on the new thing and getting our latest Android project out. The pickle that we're in is we already know that if we support only newer devices in the Android core, because if we were to go backwards and take a 4.0 project and set it to 2.2, it would definitely be full of problems. Yeah, we're narrowing the number of devices that it will run on, right? That's just kind of a given. So do we do that? Do we not do that? And with each new release of Android, it's been kind of a big decision. And so far, we've stuck with 2.2 for a couple of years now. And we've not had to say, look, let's start compiling with 3.0. Let's start compiling with 4.0 to our audience. Because frankly, there haven't been, this is my opinion, up till 4.0, anything significantly different, really, in terms of the way it worked. 4.0 now changed that. And I believe that there's some significant improvements in the way that 4.0 runs. And in my opinion, there's just no sense in making Android software that doesn't run. It's kind of an extreme remark, but if I were making an app today, it would run on 4.0 or above, or nothing else, and nothing else. And the reason for that is there's two reasons for that. One is I want to make amazing software, and 4.0 lets me do things that I couldn't do before. Awesome transitions, cool color scheme, you know, not just bland colors with, I'm talking about colors and code and gradients and some interactions and some swipes and some things that they just work better. And so that's the number one reason. The number two reason, which is a close second, and people always want to argue with me about this. Most of the people who use smartphones and identify themselves as the kinds of customers that I want to make software for use smartphones, 4.0 and up, Galaxy S3, Galaxy S4, HTC One, Nexus tablet. These are smart devices. They all run 4.0 or above. Most people who identify themselves as a smartphone user, and this is most people, who are going to buy my apps or enjoy my experience or even browse the App Store for that matter, they're pretty modern people. They're pretty modern devices. The Androids like this that support the old stuff, or even some of the older droids that are 3 years old now. You guys can't imagine my wall of shame up here. I've got all kinds of, well, I won't dig them all out, but I've got hardware and stuff. My point is, they're not really my audience. They're just not really my audience, and they might be able to use what I made, but they're probably not app-centric kind of people who get it and who are involved and excited about having a computer in their pocket. Those kinds of people have pretty much all moved on to 4.0. And so, I may be cutting out a significant number. If you talk in sheer volume, like I want to distribute an app in a maybe a faraway country that's developing that only runs 2.2 because they buy their phones at without being offensive or whatever, they're not as modern, right? Maybe they get their phone at the local market or whatever, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that, but my app's not going to work there anyway. It's contextually not made for somebody who lives in China. It doesn't have Chinese translations. It's just unfortunately true. And so for me personally, as the developer, I'm not after that market. Now, if I were, I might have to reconsider that. So our audience at BuzzTouch is generally, Western European, United States, South America, Australia. A lot of these developing countries just haven't used BuzzTouch with a lot of success yet. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. And it's not a negative thing. It's just the way it's true. And so I have to think in terms of, we have to think in terms of, BuzzTouch has to think in terms of our audience and our customers who want us to help them make good software. And so the next one will be, we haven't decided on the version, but it might be 4.0 and up. It just might be, because we want to help people make great plugins, great software, reliable, all that kind of stuff. And we might just have to kind of move on. And that's fine. It's been a bunch of years, so
Sure.
That's what I struggle with, though.